Hello, and welcome to With Roland Anderson. This is the channel where we talk about economic, political, we talk about historical and business things in simple terms. Today, we're talking about the history of the gentrification of San Juan, Puerto Rico. Now, bear with me. I may interchange San Juan and Puerto Rico back and forth, but being that 67% of the population in Puerto Rico lives in San Juan, or the San Juan area, it's the San Juan metropolitan area that I'm really reciting about. Okay. First of all, what is gentrification? Gentrification is removal of one class of people by another class of people who have better economic background. The word gentry is an old French term that fits the middle class somewhere in between the aristocracy and the working class. So that's where gentry comes from. The actual term comes from a lady named Ruth Glass in 1964 in London, who coined the term gentrification. There are some basic tools that exist in all efforts of gentrification, and it exists in San Juan. That's redlining, where certain areas can be designed to get money for investment and certain areas don't get investment for money. There is reduction of services, a la police, fire, health services. This is just in general tools that use gentrification. Some of them may or may not be used in San Juan, but as I go on, San Juan is such a unique petri dish awaiting to be gentrified. And I'm going to get to that to the end. Of all my studying, of all the 25 videos I've done on gentrification, San Juan is kind of unique, and I'm going to get to that. Okay. Some of the top tools used in gentrification are rising crime. There's a rent gap theory in gentrification where it makes more sense to get rid of the property because you're paying more in taxes than the property's worth. Tax abatements for developers. Keep that in mind when I'm talking about San Juan. The tax developments for developers. Urban and slum clearance, eminent domain, which gives the government the right to take land from people and compensate them for what they determine is market value. There are food and pharmacy and laundry problems left for those who survive, because most of the stuff, the consumer products they have bought, the stores have been replaced by museums, coffee shops, and the like. Now, Puerto Rico, San Juan has a long history from the Spanish, the Indians, all the way up to the American occupation or the American cooperation between the two entities. But we're going to start at the Treaty of Paris in 1889. And the Treaty of Paris was the result of the Spanish-American War, where the Spanish lost the war and they gave the United States control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines for $20 million. In 1917, citizenship was given to Puerto Ricans, but they did not have the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson set them up with a three-part government like we have in the United States, but the United States has veto power over that particular three-part entity. The Great Depression hit Puerto Rico, hit San Juan, and it had effect. During that time, also there was a lot of hurricanes between 1928 and 1935. In 1935, because of all the damage and from the hurricanes, and because the fact that there were depression funds available, Franklin Delano Roosevelt set up a fund and an organization in Puerto Rico as he had done under the New Deal in the United States. An interesting point in Puerto Rico, under Harry Truman, in 1944, he set up something called Operation Bootstrap. Now, Operation Bootstrap, let me start here. San Juan, Puerto Rico is a country, is a part of the United States, like some other parts, that is not self-sufficient. They import a lot of food, they import oil and all the necessary things they need to exist. So Harry Truman's idea was to try to get Puerto Rico, San Juan, Puerto Rico, to become an industrial power. And from 1944 to 1964, the income of Puerto Rico went from $27 million to $486 million. So that did work. The economy grew, jobs were there in San Juan. Massive migration from the hills. People moved to San Juan in masses. Now, along the lines in 1950, a lot of Puerto Ricanos started to move to New York and to Florida for jobs, opportunity, and education. It's said that 21% of the population left to go for those opportunities. By 1956, San Juan and Puerto Rico had an industrial base. Now, let's take a look at the population growth. In 1950, well, I should say population growth, but we're going to look at how people moved around a little bit. Let me say that for a moment, okay? San Juan's metropolitan statistical area during the 60s, 76% of the people lived in the San Juan area. San Juan was producing, Puerto Rico was producing petroleum, sugar, brewing. They had a pharmaceutical company and tobacco industry. But by 1970, this is when cities began to fold. And what happened in 1970 was that the Far East began to produce goods cheaper than the West could. And San Juan was impacted dramatically by the loss of the revenue that it was getting from industrial production, and sort of lean more toward tourism. The foreign competition had sort of put an end to the industrial growth by the 70s. But what happened in San Juan was kind of interesting. In Puerto Rico, there was a lot of fraud, a lot of mismanagement, union payoffs, tremendous amount of waste, and the economy couldn't keep up with it. Even though they had tourism, they had finance, they had real estate, they had some electronics and chemical business, San Juan couldn't keep up with competing against, or Puerto Rico couldn't keep up with competing against the East. Now, By 2008, there were more people living in the United States of Puerto Rican descent than there was in San Juan. An important note, and this is why I'm going back now to where I said that San Juan is a petri dish for gentrification. Puerto Rico, because of the fraud, because of mismanagement, was $70 billion in debt to creditors. Now, mind you, there's only 4 million people in Puerto Rico, and the debt was $70 billion. There's no possible way they could ever repay that. So what they did is they went to court and they knocked it down to $3 billion, which is still something that's almost impossible for them to pay. Then comes Hurricane Maria, the infrastructure goes destroyed, the poverty levels at 43%. And this is where it gets interesting. This is where the developers and the realtors see the opportunity. Puerto Rico is so much in debt. They restructured their debt, but they've now got to figure out a way to pay even the $73 billion that the restructuring settlement was. That's 7 to 3 cents on a dollar they got, the creditors. So what I'm saying is now that Puerto Rico has to come up with this money, it's a petri dish for developers. You're going to see Airbnbs all over the place. They're going to offer low taxes for people to move their businesses to Puerto Rico. One of the benefits that they did get, and which is going to make it interesting for people who want to build in Puerto Rico, is Hurricane Maria destroyed the infrastructure. So now they have to build out a whole brand new 21st century infrastructure. It has tremendous seaports, a really inexpensive labor force, and the safety of the United States government. This is why Puerto Rico and San Juan is probably the most unique place I looked at, because it is waiting to be gentrified. And it's going to be gentrified in a massive way. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me. If you're on Facebook, check the follow. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. And I'll try to bring you more. Thank you very much. Have a great day.